This is the History of Computers, Part 1, the Bulletin Board System. This article was originally published by Network World on August 28th of the year of our Lord, 2017. This series on the history of computers was cut short due to a changing focus of Network World as a publication. It is being republished here as this series is being resumed under the Lunduke Journal. I used to be a journalist over at Network World. I reported on mostly Linuxy, consumer electronics, that sort of thing at Network World for, golly gee, many years. And as this series was kicking off on the history of computers, we got through the first two parts of it. And then we decided, or someone else decided, that Network World's focus was going to change and focus solely on enterprisey stuff and the like. That kind of bummed me out, but luckily, now that I'm over here at the Lunduke Journal at lunduke.com, I can republish these and resume what I feel like is probably one of the most important article series that I could possibly be doing, covering some of the most interesting, at least in my opinion, aspects of the history of computers and computing in general. I feel like this needs a lot more attention, and this is my opportunity to do that. So I'm going to read this to you now. This is part 1. And if you would like to read this for yourself, you can go on over to lunduke.com. There we go. Here we are. Let's rock and roll. One weird little quirk about being human is that we as a group tend to think things have been the way they currently are for a whole heck of a lot longer than they actually have been, and that they're not likely to change. Even the most hard and well-backed up science tends to change with the proverbial wind. For example, cholesterol, good or bad? See? Things and ideas change fast, and we often don't think that they've changed at all. Cholesterol is a great example because for a period of time we assumed cholesterol was going to murder us. So we invented margarine, and margarine was going to save every man, woman, and child on the planet from the evils of butter. Now we've realized margarine's probably going to kill you. This sort of thing happens with intense regularity, and a lot of times we just sort of gloss over it. Whether we're talking about science, climate science models, health science models, computer science models, any of it, things change very rapidly, and people tend to forget how things were just 10, 20, or 30 years prior. So sometimes it's good to sit back and look at how things have already changed in order to see how things might change in the future. In this article series, let's look over each major era and type of computer systems, servers, clients, networking, the works, in no particular order. I'll be bouncing around a bit from one era to another as I tell the story of computers. Right? We're going all over the map here. And really, these are individual little bite-sized stories of the history of computers. Stuff that just doesn't get talked about enough. Stuff that people gloss over entirely. And we're starting with something that's very near and dear to my heart. Something that I've covered a lot recently on the Lunduke Show. Bulletin board systems. I call this the bulletin board system servers. Now let's start with something that for many, this might seem a little unusual. The dial-up bulletin board system, also known as a BBS. You see, we didn't always have the ability to obtain always available physical connections to a server. During the 80s and 90s, one of the most common ways that average people went online was to use a dial-up BBS. A modem on your computer would literally dial over an old-style analog phone line, aka a copper landline, or a POTS line, which stands for plain old telephone service, and connect to another modem connected to a different computer. A fun fact here, a lot of people don't know this, but modem actually stands for modulator demodulator, MO-DEM. It takes binary data and modulates it, making the most soothing sound on the planet for nerds in the 1980s, and sends it over the phone line, analog, and demodulates it on the other side with the other modem. These BBSs were, in a very real way, servers. The biggest difference between those dial-up bulletin boards and servers of today is in the way people connect, and because of that, how many people could connect at once. You could almost think of each modem and phone line connected to a given BBS as a single socket that could support one connection at a time. 3 modems equals 3 people connected at once. Now, the idea of having only a handful of people, or even just one person, able to connect to your server at a time is somewhat preposterous nowadays, at least in most environments. Yet that's the way it was back then, and when there were no more modems and phone lines available, you'd get an honest-to-goodness busy signal, a noise that kids of today probably have never even heard. It's amazing to me. I was talking to an 18-year-old or 19-year-old, this was at the last convention I was at, who'd never heard a busy signal. We had to look it up online so we could get a little wave file of a busy signal so this kid could hear what a busy signal sounded like. Most people don't have busy signals anymore. Most people just don't even have home phone lines anymore. Times have changed. Fun fact number 2. Many BBS operators, also known as sysops or system operators, used a tool that many called a busy switch when they needed to take a BBS offline for maintenance. It's sort of like how you'd have like a under construction or we'll be back in a minute sort of page that would show up on a website while you're working on a website or updating a database or something. A busy switch was simply a plain telephone cord with one end cut off. So you take the telephone cord, right? And then here's would be the end of it, and you'd go up maybe an inch or two and you'd snip it, right? Take the end cut off, and the 2 wires of the telephone line, because there's really just 2 wires in that telephone line, stripped of their shielding, so they're bare wires, and then you twist them together so they have a connection. Then you plug it into the phone jack in your wall, right? Thus, it emulates the connected state of an old-style telephone line, resulting in a busy signal because the line is connected. When you have an old style telephone line, when you pick up the receiver and put it to your head, what you're really doing internally when you raise the receiver up is you are connecting those 2 lines to create a connection. Now, when they're not connected, a connection's available. So it'll ring on your phone line because there's actual electricity going through those copper lines. But when those connections are paired together, it results in a busy signal for anyone attempting to call that line. In the 80s and 90s, it was not uncommon to find a sysop with several homemade busy switches floating around their desks. I had 5 or 6 because you'd need one, and you couldn't find the last one you made because they're just little tiny pieces of wire. And I'd look around in my little rummage drawers with all my other junk and cables. I couldn't find one, so I'd find a phone cable, strip it, take 2 seconds, and make my new busy switch. A busy switch is something that has just been lost. It's just a little bit of computing history that just people don't think about anymore. What's more, the speeds were hard limited on a connection basis. If you had a 14.4K modem, that's the maximum speed that data could be transmitted over that connection. You couldn't simply bring in a faster connection to increase the speed for all your users. You would need to upgrade each modem to accomplish that. So nowadays, if you're running a web server or an FTP server, you upgrade one fiber channel or one Comcast line or one Ethernet line or something, and then everyone benefits from the speed increase. In the old days, you had to upgrade for every single modem, which is a big difference. Even then, the quality of the analog lines between your BBS server and your connected client played a huge role in the actual speed you got. I suppose that last part is still true today, though most people don't notice it very much. It was a big deal back then. If you were calling a phone line, especially if you had to call a long distance line, the analog lines that you were calling over, you'd get signal degradation and line noise as you went, and that would result in significantly degraded speed of your connection because you're sending basically sound, right? You're sending sound through the phone line that gets demodulated and modulated back and forth into binary data. The more noise that's on the line, the more data correction that has to occur, the more bits and noises that has to be sent, and you get slower speeds. Now, that wasn't the only way most BBSs differed from modern servers, like web servers and the like. Most BBSs in existence ran on an operating system such as DOS or CP/M or Apple ProDOS and other non-multitasking systems. That meant only one instance of the BBS server could be running on a single computer at a time. Now, this wasn't always true. People did run BBSs on Unix-style systems. On OS/2 was a very popular one in the BBS scene in the 90s especially. But by and large, Amigas, people tended to run BBSs under Amigas, and you could multitask those to a certain degree. But most of the time, people ran BBSs on non-multitasking systems, which meant one user connected, one computer. Want to have a BBS that ran on, say, MS-DOS that could allow for two people to connect at the same time, meaning two remote people calling in to your BBS at one time? You would need a second computer, and those two computers would need to be networked together, such as through an old token ring network, to share critical files with one another. Side note, you don't get to bring up token ring networks very often. Look that one up, kiddos. That way, for those two dialed-in users, they would feel as if they were on the same system and be able to interact accordingly. Usually, you'd have to have BBS server software. They didn't call it server software; it was just BBS software back then. That understood that we were talking between two different computers in order to share files. A lot of times, it was just sharing plain text files back and forth, and possibly just stored on a central server or stored on one of those BBS computers itself. Now imagine if that were the case with web servers. For every theoretical concurrent connection, you'd need to add another computer. A whole new computer for every connection. That's absolutely crazy to consider nowadays. In 2020, I mean, who would even think of that? Even 10 years ago, that would be preposterous to think about, but that's how it was. Now, BBS servers and door programs are kind of an interesting thing. BBS servers were also interesting in that their functionality could be extended. And the most common method is via what were known as door programs. Door, just spelled D-O-O-R, like a door. When the user requested a specific door. So, for example, I would call a BBS on my modem, be connected in there, and I would say, I want to play this game or run this piece of software. That was a door program. And the entire BBS that I was connected to would then shrink out of memory, right? Not multitasking. Remember that. So if I was connected to a DOS system, the BBS software would exit. It just shut itself down and it launched the requested application that I was trying to run. Remember, these were running on systems that could not multitask. This was a big deal. So the BBS, what it would do is it would first write the details of the connected user, what physical modem was in use, the user name, that sort of thing. There really usually wasn't a lot of information. And it would write it all to a simple text file. And then the BBS would close down and run the requested application, the door, which would know to load that specific text file in that very specific spot in order to continue using the modem, which was sitting connected and waiting the whole time. It's kind of an interesting approach, really. Basically, it says, here's a piece of physical resource, the modem. I'm not going to hang up. I'm the BBS. I'm just going to exit, run this other application that's going to load the text file and say, hey, I'm using this modem on this COM port with this IRQ, whatever, right? And it would just say, okay, and I'll just pick right back up, assuming there's still a connection. And it would just start using it again. And it was when that program was done, it would exit and relaunch the BBS. That's how it was done back in the day. And it's a phenomenal system. Now, these BBS servers handled email that was not unlike that of today. The primary difference being that instant delivery of email occurred only on the local BBS system. So if you're on one BBS and you send an email to another user on that same BBS, they got it immediately, right? But if you sent an email to a user on a different BBS, that user wouldn't be able to read that email until the two BBS systems performed a regular, often like one time per night, connect to trade emails with each other. This was a really common way to do it. Now, many BBSs had no connection to any other BBSs. So you could only email the people that were on that BBS. But some connected to FidoNet and many VirtualNet and tons of other message networks to allow people to trade emails between a wide variety of other systems. Now, each connection between two BBS servers was considered a single hop, right? Often, in order to get an email delivered to a physical location that was very far away, multiple such hops were required. The email would be delivered to one BBS on the first night, and then the next BBS in the line each night. With this system, which was incredibly popular in the 1980s and into part of the 90s, email was not an instantaneous thing. It was not unheard of for email delivery to actually take longer than postal mail. That is not a joke. That is very, very real. In fact, many BBS systems, because of the way this was all structured, and they would have to use a modem to physically dial another BBS to do this package transfer of the email packages between the different systems. They would try to do it via local numbers. And many people nowadays won't understand the idea of long distance calls. But in the olden days, you usually could only call locally for free. If you called longer distance, it cost extra per minute, which meant the BBSs, in some cases, could be connected for half an hour, sometimes even more, to transfer all these messages around. So they try to minimize the amount of long distance calling to keep the cost as low as possible for running a BBS. So what they would do is they would actually add many hops. So instead of calling all the way across the country in one evening, what they would do is they'd wait until 2 a.m, the period of time when long distance calling was either the cheapest or people were just using the BBS the least. And it would call close. It would call somewhere close by. So it wasn't necessarily a long distance call. And if you get kind of finicky about it and really, really creative, you can make it so it just takes 20 hops to get from the West Coast to the East Coast. But that means it might take many days to get there. Sometimes a week or more to get there. Still, millions of people use such services for email. At its peak, the most popular such network on BBSs was known as FidoNet. And it consisted of over 39,000 dial-up bulletin board systems across the world. I mean, that's a lot of places for people to call in and exchange email on the same message network. And the inner workings of these systems was likewise rather unique. Most were run, especially in the 80s, on the non-multitasking systems, which meant the concept of concurrent user load wasn't something that most system operators had to worry about. Now think about that for a second. Because we're talking one user at a time, it meant performance load handling wasn't typically a big concern. Right? You didn't have to worry about, how efficient is each load, how efficient is, the load time and whatnot of individual pages on your web server. You didn't have to worry about that. In fact, most BBSs had very low-tech databases for storing the user information, often either plain or structured text files or simple homegrown binary file formats. You definitely never heard about a sharded SQL database, right? So you don't have mirrored database systems. You don't have any of that stuff. It was very, very low tech compared to nowadays. It was very simple. And it was very efficient. But it did mean that the things you worry about for running a server in 2020 were really not the things you worried about when running a BBS type server in the 80s and then into the early 90s. It just was a very, very different idea. Now, by almost every way you can imagine, the BBS server concept and structure is far inferior to anything we have today, certainly far more low-tech, and yet there are some unique advantages to such a BBS server. Perhaps most notable, the barrier to entry was astoundingly low for hobbyists and amateur computer users to set up and run their own BBS. With a computer with almost any operating system, a modem of almost any speed, and a phone line, preferably without too much line noise, which oftentimes was the hardest and biggest challenge in setting one of these up, you were good to go. Many BBSs didn't even run on hard drives. A lot of the earlier ones just ran off of a floppy disk or a couple floppy disks. In fact, there are BBSs running today that you can get to via Telnet that run off of like old Apples and Commodore 64s on floppy disks. That's totally real. And that's super, super cool. Now, I mean, think about that. Now, while the barrier to entry for, say, putting your website online is very low today, it's very easy to go sign up at Linode or one of the other services and have a web server up and running where you can post your files and put your blog online or what have you. That's very, very easy to do, right? But if you want to run your own server, like physical server, there's still a big barrier to entry there. The cost can be a little bit higher, though. If you just have an old PC laying around, that can do the job. But there's also a lot more things to learn. Learning how to properly load and secure Apache and Nginx and MySQL and Postgres and so many other things. While if you're in the business, it's not too difficult. And it's something that anyone can theoretically do. It still is a higher barrier to entry than running a BBS used to be. Because again, you didn't have to worry about server load type stuff. If you had a DOS machine and it was running, I mean, you could run an old 286 with 640K of RAM and running off of the cheapest hard drive you could possibly find, and you could run a very successful BBS. I did that back in the 90s. So it's just a very, very different approach. And amazingly enough, many BBSs still run today. I even run one that people connect to via Telnet. Why? Mostly because I enjoy working with these older systems. It keeps me grounded and closer to the roots of computing. My BBS reminds me that I connect over my ultra-fast when I connect over my ultra-fast fiber connection to my multiple servers hosted around the world, capable of serving huge loads of concurrent users. It wasn't always this way. Things used to be very different. The protocols change. The connection type and speed and frequency change. The server capabilities and storage change. The way I administer it and the way that I use it, it all changes. None of it stays the same. When I say it like that, it kind of makes me sad. It makes me wistful for the days of screeching modems and slow transfer speeds. But then again, it's rather nice being able to run a server with a web page which has more than one person logging into it and seeing it at a time. That's pretty cool. That was something that didn't happen back in the 80s. At least not for most people using the BBS. So trade-offs. Anyway, this is I've talked about BBSs a lot over the last week, and I promise we won't be talking too much more about BBSs over the coming weeks ahead. But this is kind of an interesting tidbit because the history of BBSs is something that I was very closely involved with from the very late 80s through really through most of the 90s and even today. So this was me recounting history that is half my history and half BBSing history. Tomorrow, we have part 2 where we're going to be going over the history of TCP/IP and how, well, Xerox had more to play in that than maybe a lot of people would like to talk about. If you want to read all these articles, definitely go check them out at lunduke.com. If you want to watch the show, if you want to watch the videos produced here at the Lunduke Journal, go over to lunduke.com. There's links for watching the show on Library, LBRY, or YouTube. Highly recommend LBRY. It's a better experience, in my opinion. You get the downloaded DRM-free MP4 files. There's no crazy tracking of everything you do and whatnot like the Alphabet Company does with YouTube. Also, you can listen to this show. There's RSS podcast links and all that sort of good stuff. And there's an RSS feed for the articles as well. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that this show, what I do, these articles, is made possible both by you, by supporting me over at Patreon. There's links at the bottom of all the articles where you can support this show at patreon.com. Give to the show. Every little dollar goes towards keeping the lights on and making more shows, more articles, all that good stuff, as well as you can buy t-shirts over at the Lunduke store, very, very nerdy t-shirts, and Linode. Linode helps make this show possible. If you go to linode.com/Lunduke, you can get a $20 credit apply towards setting up a Linode server, and you can just rock out over there for $20. Goes a long way over at Linode, I'm telling you. And you know what's cool? When you set up a server at Linode, it can take more than one concurrent connection at a time. That's pretty neat. At least it is for the people who, like me, feel like they're getting old. So go over there. You can set all that up and rock on out with Linode. They also have a bunch of like one-click applications. So you can I want to set up a server where I'm running a WordPress blog. Boop. You do that and boom. Bob's your uncle. You got a WordPress blog rocking and roll. Linode.com/Lunduke for the $20 credit. All right, everybody. Thank you much for hanging out with me and for indulging me as I reminisce wistfully about days of yore, and I hope you have a truly fantastic day where you play around with really old computers, just like the good Lord intended. All right, I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.